My uncle almost burst out laughing when he found out he got the house, the money, and the car, while all I got was an old anchor. Life in Miami hits different when you're living paycheck to paycheck. I'm Jason Clark, 31, construction worker by day, professional microwave dinner enthusiast by night. My apartment is what realtors call cozy. Normal people call it tiny. But it's mine, or at least until rent's due again next Friday. The springs in my couch have memorized the shape of my back after countless evenings of collapsing there after 10-hour shifts. Those metal coils are basically roommates at this point. They poke me when I sit wrong, just like my ex used to. The coffee maker in the kitchen corner churns out liquid that technically meets the legal definition of coffee, filling my humble kingdom with that burnt morning smell that's become weirdly comforting. My neighbors argue like it's an Olympic sport they're training for. The couple upstairs, never met them, but I know their life story through the paper-thin ceiling. He forgot their anniversary again. She's tired of his mother calling during dinner. The usual greatest hits album of relationship problems on repeat. But I've got the perfect remedy for drowning out Miami's symphony of arguments and traffic. My cassette player. Yeah, I still rock one of those ancient relics. Digital music just doesn't have the soul, you know? That slight hiss between tracks is like an old friend saying hello. And Elvis, man, Elvis is a soundtrack to my life. When Hound Dog cranks up through those scratchy speakers, suddenly my kingdom doesn't seem so small anymore. My co-workers think I'm weird for it. Dude, Elvis? Seriously? My grandma listens to that stuff. They say while scrolling through whatever auto-tune trash is trending this week. They don't get it. Elvis isn't just music. It's time travel. It's freedom. It's a memory of better days. And those better days? They belong to weekends on Grandpa Fred's boat. Sea Dream, he called her. Nothing fancy. Just a weathered 24-footer with more personality than half the people I know. Those Saturdays were sacred. We'd push off in the marina, just as the sun was burning away the morning mist, motor out past the jetty where the water turns that impossible shade of blue that no phone camera can ever capture right. Grandpa Fred was a mechanic by trade, retired by choice, and a philosopher by nature. His hands were like topographical maps, all ridges and valleys, calluses and oil stains that never quite washed away. The man could fix anything, car engines, boat motors, broken lawn mowers, even broken spirits. Mine needed fixing more often than I'd like to admit. After my parents split when I was 9, Dad vanished to start a new family in Arizona, and Mom worked double shifts just to keep the lights on. But weekends, those were for Grandpa Fred and me. He'd crank blue suede shoes on his portable radio, the music mixing with salt spray as we cast our lines into the Atlantic. Some days we'd catch enough for dinner. Other days we'd catch nothing but sunburns and stories. It never mattered either way. The fishing was just the excuse. Life, Jason, he'd tell me while adjusting his faded Marlins cap, is like an Elvis song. Without soul, it's just noise. Then he'd tap his chest right over his heart. The rhythm's got to come from in here, or the music don't mean a thing. He taught me everything worth knowing. How to bait a hook, change oil, shake hands with proper eye contact, and treat people with respect even when they don't deserve it. When I dropped out of community college after 2 semesters, it was Grandpa who didn't lecture me. He just nodded, handed me his toolbox, and showed me how to build stuff instead. College shapes minds, he'd say, but hands shape the world. Then he'd wink and add, besides, Elvis never finished high school, and he did all right. That was Grandpa, finding silver linings in storm clouds and wisdom in places most people just walk past. When the call came in last month, I was hanging drywall on a new condo project near South Beach. Grandpa Fred, gone at 78, heart attack while working on his lawn mower. Quick and painless, the doctor said, just the way a man like him would want to go, with grease on his hands and projects still unfinished. The funeral was small. Grandpa wasn't big on fuss. Just me, some old buddies from his mechanic days, and the family vultures, Uncle Roy and Aunt Marge. They showed up in their Mercedes, him with his beard straining against an expensive suit, her with diamond bracelets that clinked like ice in a whiskey glass every time she raised her hand to her face in theatrical grief. They'd visited Grandpa maybe twice in the past decade, both times to borrow money they never returned. But family is family, I guess, even when they're barely that. The week after we put Grandpa on the ground was a fog. I kept expecting his daily phone calls. Just checking in, asking if I'd eaten something besides microwave burritos, telling me about some documentary he'd watched about ancient aliens or deep-sea creatures. The silence in my apartment was louder than any construction site I'd ever worked on. Then came the call from the lawyer. Grandpa had left a will, and we were all to meet for the reading. I'm not going to lie, a tiny spark of hope flickered in my chest. Not for money. Grandpa was comfortable, but not rich. But for the boat, our sea dream. The floating piece of freedom where we'd spend hundreds of hours talking about everything and nothing at all. I dreamed of taking her out on Saturdays, playing Elvis just like Grandpa did, keeping our tradition alive. Maybe someday having a son of my own to teach fishing and philosophy, passing down Grandpa's wisdom to another generation. In my mind, the boat was already mine, the one meaningful inheritance that would keep Grandpa's spirit alive in my world. The lawyer's office smelled like leather and expensive cologne. One of those downtown firms with views of the bay and furniture that probably cost more than I make in 3 months. I sat across from Uncle Roy and Aunt Marge, trying not to make eye contact. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a chainsaw. Mr. Peterson, the lawyer, was all business. Gray suit, gray hair, gray personality. He pushed his glasses up his nose and began reading the will with about as much emotion as my coffee maker. The house, that modest 3-bedroom ranch where Grandpa had lived for 40 years, left Uncle Roy and Aunt Marge. The savings account, a decent sum from decades of careful living, split between them. The vintage car collection, 3 restored beauties that Grandpa had poured his heart into, also theirs. With each announcement, their smiles grew wider. I kept waiting for my name, for the boat, the last piece of Grandpa I could hold on to. The lawyer cleared his throat. And to my grandson Jason Clark, I leave my anchor from the sea dream, along with the attached note. That was it. Not the boat, not even a fishing rod. Just an anchor? The lawyer handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in Grandpa's shaky handwriting. Uncle Roy couldn't contain himself. His laugh was like a foghorn, loud, obnoxious, and impossible to ignore. An anchor? That's rich. What are you going to do with that, Jason? Open a maritime museum in your apartment? He slapped his knee like it was the funniest joke he'd ever heard. Aunt Marge's diamond bracelet jingled as she covered her mouth, failing to hide her smirk. Maybe he can use it as a doorstop. God knows it's about all it's good for. I sat there, stunned, clutching the envelope. The anchor was in the lawyer's storage room. He informed me I could pick it up on my way out, along with the boat keys, which I was to hand over to Uncle Roy, as the sea dream was now his property. My hands balled into fists. This couldn't be right. The boat was supposed to be mine, our special place, the one thing that connected me to Grandpa more than anything else. There must be some mistake, I managed to say, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. Mr. Peterson adjusted his glasses again. No mistake, Mr. Clark. The will is quite clear. Uncle Roy was already talking about selling the boat. Never was one for fishing, he said to no one in particular. But I bet it'll fetch a nice price. Maybe enough of that hot tub I've been eyeing for my backyard, or a new set of golf clubs. The idea of strangers on our boat, or worse, it being sold for parts, made my stomach turn. But what could I do? The will was legal, final. Grandpa had made his choice, as impossible as it seemed to believe. I left that office with an anchor I couldn't use and a hole in my chest that felt like it would never fill. The drive back to my apartment was a blur. Elvis played on the radio, Heartbreak Hotel, because sometimes the universe has a sixth sense of humor. Back home, I tore open the envelope. Inside was a single piece of paper with Grandpa's handwriting. This is your treasure, Jason. Find it. Love, Grandpa Fred. That's it. No explanation. No map. No clue what he meant. Just a cryptic message in an old rusty anchor that must weigh at least 40 pounds. I sat on my spring-infested couch, the envelope in one hand, a warm beer in the other, try and make sense of it all. Why would he give me an anchor? Why not the boat? What kind of treasure was I supposed to find? Grandpa wasn't the type for practical jokes, especially not from beyond the grave. There had to be something I was missing, some deeper meaning behind his final gift. I remembered something he told me once, after I got passed over for a promotion I'd worked my ass off for. We were out on the water, lines cast, Elvis singing about suspicious minds in the background. "The real treasure in this life, Jason," he'd said, watching the horizon instead of his fishing line, "is the heart that plays its own melody even when the world tells it to be quiet." At the time, I thought it was just another one of his philosophical nuggets, words that sounded nice but didn't pay the bills. Now I wondered if there was more to it. I dug through my closet until I found my old cassette player and the tape Grandpa had given me for my birthday years ago, Elvis's greatest hits. I popped it in, hit play, and Love Me Tender filled my tiny apartment. The song took me back to those days on the water, the sun on my face, Grandpa's laughter mixing with the call of seagulls. And suddenly, the walls of my apartment felt like they were closing in. I needed air. I needed the ocean. I needed something I couldn't name. I grabbed my keys and drove to the lawyer's office just before closing time. The anchor was waiting for me, old, rusty, heavier than it looked. It took both the receptionist and me to load it into the back of my beat-up pickup. The drive home with that anchor sliding around my truck bed with every turn was a metaphor for my life, if ever there was one. Dragging around a weight I didn't ask for, trying not to let it damage what little I had left. Getting it up to my third-floor apartment was a special kind of hell. By the time I managed to drag it inside, my back was screaming, my hands were scraped raw, and I'd learned several new curse words from the elderly neighbor who had to squeeze past me on the stairs. I dropped in the middle of my living room floor with a thud that probably gave the downstairs neighbors a heart attack. Sweat dripped down my face as I collapsed next to it, out of breath and out of patience. What am I supposed to do with you? I asked the anchor, feeling only slightly crazy for talking to an inanimate object. What's the big secret, huh? The apartment was quiet except for Elvis singing about tender love. Outside, Miami continued its never-ending party. Car horns, distant music, the occasional siren. Inside, it was just me and this piece of rusted metal that was supposedly my inheritance. I ran my hand over the anchor's surface, feeling its rough texture, years of saltwater damage, and the cold metal against my palm. There was something about its weight, its presence in my apartment that felt strangely significant. This wasn't just junk. It was the last thing Grandpa wanted me to have. As I examined it closer, I noticed subtle marks that didn't look like ordinary rust or wear. Scratches that seemed almost deliberate. The way certain sections had been painted over recently, different from the older layers beneath. "Grandpa," I whispered, feeling simultaneously foolish and hopeful. "What were you trying to tell me?" The anchor, of course, didn't answer. But as I sat there on my apartment floor, Elvis crooning through my scratchy speakers, that heavy piece of metal in front of me, I felt something I hadn't since Grandpa died, a tiny spark of curiosity. Like maybe, just maybe, this wasn't the end of the story. "All right, old man," I murmured to the empty room, to the memory of Grandpa Fred, to the mysteriously warm anchor in my arms. "I'll play along. Let's find this treasure of yours." I barely slept that night. Those strange markings on the anchor kept replaying in my mind like a scratched record. By 6 a.m., I gave up trying, brewed some of that almost coffee, and sat staring at the hulking piece of metal taking up half my living room floor. Morning sunlight streamed through my blinds, highlighting the anchor's imperfections. The rust patterns, the weathered surface, and those deliberate-looking scratches. Something wasn't adding up. Grandpa was meticulous about his boat and equipment. He wouldn't keep an anchor this rusted unless there was a reason. The note kept echoing in my head. "This is your treasure, Jason. Find it." Not "this is your treasure," but "find it." Like the anchor itself wasn't a treasure, but a map to something else. I needed a proper workspace. My cramped apartment wasn't cutting it, and my landlord would have a conniption if I started power tools at 6:30 a.m. There was only one place I could think of, Grandpa's old garage workshop. Sure, technically it belonged to Uncle Roy and Aunt Marge now, but they lived across town and wouldn't be moving Grandpa's stuff out for at least a few weeks. Besides, they'd never set foot in that garage if they could help it. Too much grease, too much work, too much. Grandpa. I called in sick to work. First time in 3 years. My foreman wasn't happy, but a stomach bug is a stomach bug. Even if mine was actually an inheritance mystery that needed solving. Loading that anchor back into my truck was easier in daylight. Though my neighbor Mrs. Gonzalez watched suspiciously from her doorway, probably wondering if I was running some kind of maritime black market operation from my apartment. The drive to Grandpa's place was a trip down memory lane, past a diner where we get breakfast after fishing, past a hardware store where Grandpa knew every employee by name, through neighborhoods where houses were getting bigger and fancier while somehow looking all the same. Grandpa's house sat at the end of a quiet street, modest compared to the McMansion sprouting up around it, but solid, 1 story, faded blue paint, and a porch swing that hosted countless evening conversations. The mailbox still had Clark painted on it in Grandpa's steady hand. I drove around back, hoping none of the neighbors would recognize me and start asking questions. The last thing I needed was Uncle Roy getting a call that I was trespassing on his property. The detached garage stood like a time capsule, weatherwood siding, oil stains on the concrete apron, that familiar dent in the door from when I was 16 and accidentally backed Grandpa's lawnmower into it. I still had the spare key on my keychain, right next to my apartment key. Some things you just never remove. The door creaked open, releasing the smell of motor oil, old wood, and memories so thick you could almost touch them. I hadn't been here since before Grandpa died, but nothing had changed. The garage was mostly empty now. Grandpa had sold his last project car months ago. Workbenches lined the walls, tools hung in perfect order, each one with its outlined shadow painted on the pegboard. Grandpa's system, everything in its place. I hauled the anchor inside and set it on the main workbench. The morning sun filtered through dusty windows, casting long beams across the concrete floor. For a moment, I just stood there, letting the familiar surroundings wash over me. This was Grandpa's kingdom, a place where broken things got fixed, where problems had solutions, where patience and the right tools could solve almost anything. I reached for his old cassette player on the shelf, blew off the dust, and checked for a tape. Elvis Presley's greatest hits was still in there, right where he'd left it. I hit play, and Can't Help Falling in Love crackled through the speakers, filling the garage with Grandpa's presence so strongly I half expected to turn around and see him standing there in his oil-stained coveralls. "All right, Grandpa," I said to the empty garage, "is this your final concert? What were you trying to tell me?" I remembered something from about a week before Grandpa went into the hospital for the last time. I'd stopped by to help him with some yard work, and he was in this very garage, hunched over something on the workbench. When I asked what he was doing, he quickly covered it up, saying he was just cleaning an old boat part. I caught a glimpse of the anchor before he threw a rag over it. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Grandpa was always tinkering with something. But now it seemed significant. He'd smiled that mischievous smile of his, the one that appeared when he was up to something clever. "Old anchors are like old songs, Jason," he'd said, wiping his hands on a rag. "They've got soul in them, history, stories to tell if you know how to listen." I'd laughed it off then. Just another one of Grandpa's philosophical moments. But standing here now, with the same anchor in front of me and Elvis setting the soundtrack, those words felt like clues. I grabbed a wire brush from Grandpa's tool wall and began carefully scrubbing at the rust. Maybe there are diamonds hidden inside. I joked to myself. I could buy myself a yacht. Captain Jason of the SS. More money than sense. As I worked, the rust flaked away, revealing more of those strange markings I'd noticed the night before. They weren't random. They formed a pattern around one section of the anchor. And there, right along the main shaft, was a seam that shouldn't be there. A line of fresh paint, carefully applied to look like part of the original surface, but distinctly newer under close inspection. My heart rate picked up like the drums in Jailhouse Rock. This wasn't a normal anchor. Something had been modified, hidden, sealed shut. I rummaged through Grandpa's tools until I found his electric drill and a small metal cutting bit. Working carefully, I drilled along the suspicious seam, metal shavings flying as Elvis transitioned to Suspicious Minds, the universe's soundtrack department really nailing the timing. The drill bit caught and jumped as it broke through to a hollow space inside. I set the drill down, hands suddenly shaky with anticipation. Using a flathead screwdriver as a lever, I pried along the weakened seam until, with a metallic groan, the section popped open. Inside the anchor's hollow core was a sealed metal cylinder about the size of a rolled-up magazine. Not huge, but big enough to hold several folded documents. Waterproof, airtight, the kind of container you'd use if you wanted something to survive a nuclear blast or, more relevantly, years submerged in salt water. I unscrewed the cap with trembling fingers and tipped the contents onto Grandpa's workbench, a roll of paper secured with a rubber band and a handwritten note on top. My throat tightened as I recognized Grandpa's distinctive handwriting, slightly slanted, all capitals, pressing so hard into the paper you could feel the indentations on the back. Jason, this island is our dream. Bought it in '60. It's yours now. Sing your song. I unrolled the papers with the care of someone handling ancient scrolls. The first was a notarized deed for a small island off the Florida coast. The second was a property survey with coordinates. The third was a draft agreement, something about leasing the island to a film production company. My mind raced trying to make sense of it all. An island? Grandpa owned an island and never told anyone? The deed was updated and notarized just 2 weeks ago, right around when I caught him working on the anchor in his garage. Everything suddenly clicked into place. The memory of seeing him hunched over the anchor, claiming he was just cleaning off rust. The way he covered it quickly when I walked in. He wasn't cleaning it. He was hiding these documents inside it. I laughed out loud, the sound echoing off the garage walls. "You old rock and roll fox," I said to the empty room, to Grandpa's spirit that somehow still filled this space. "You sneaky son of a gun." The deed was clear as day, transferring ownership of a small island near Key Largo to me, Jason Clark. All legal, all official, all signed and filed with the proper authorities. This wasn't some practical joke or wild goose chase. This was real. I sat down hard on Grandpa's workshop stool, documents spread before me, trying to process what I just discovered. Grandpa had owned an island since the 1960s and kept it secret from everyone, even me, until now. The island wasn't mentioned in the will that was read at the lawyer's office. Instead, Grandpa had hidden the deed inside the anchor and made sure I got the anchor. Why all the secrecy? Why not just leave me the island in his will alongside everything else? The answer came to me as Elvis crooned about returning to sender. Uncle Roy and Aunt Marge. If they'd known about the island, they would have fought for it tooth and nail. They had money for lawyers, for court battles, for dragging things out until I gave up from sheer exhaustion, and legal fees. By transferring the island to me before his death and keeping the documentation hidden, Grandpa had ensured they couldn't touch it. It wasn't part of his estate, wasn't subject to challenges or probate or family squabbles. It was already mine. That's why he made sure I got the anchor and nothing else. He knew if he'd left me both the boat and the anchor, I might never have examined the anchor closely. I would have used it as, well, an anchor without ever discovering its secret. The old man had thought of everything, had set up this elaborate puzzle, knowing I'd be the only one to solve it, had trusted me to follow the breadcrumbs even when they made no sense. I stared at the island deed, trying to remember if Grandpa had ever mentioned owning property in the Keys. Nothing came to mind. But then again, keeping this secret must have been important to him. Maybe he'd been planning this reveal for years, waiting for the right moment, waiting until I was ready. Only problem was, death had come calling before that perfect moment arrived. So he'd improvised, hiding the truth in plain sight, gambling that I'd be curious enough, persistent enough, to find it. The draft agreement with the film production company was dated just a month ago. Grandpa had been in negotiations to lease the island for a movie shoot. something that would have generated significant income. He'd been setting things up for me, preparing a future I never knew was possible. I picked up the notarized deed again, running my fingers over the embossed seal, the official language declaring me the rightful owner of, I checked the name, Harmony Key, a private island of approximately 5 acres. Harmony Key. I'd never heard of it, never been there, had no idea what it looked like or what condition it was in. For all I knew, it could be an underwater sandbar at high tide or a mosquito-infested mud patch. But it was mine, my island, my opportunity. The survey map showed a roughly oval-shaped piece of land with what looked like a small natural harbor on one side. The elevation markers suggested it rose a decent height above sea level. Not just a flood-prone flatland, but an actual habitable island. Thoughts whirled through my mind like debris in a hurricane. What does one do with an island? Sell it for a quick payday? Develop it? Build a beach shack and become a hermit? Start my own micronation and print currency with my face on it? The agreement draft with the film company provided a more practical suggestion. The production had been interested in using the island as a location for a period beach movie, something set in the 1960s. They'd been willing to pay a surprisingly large sum for a month's access. Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Grandpa hadn't just gifted me a random piece of real estate. He'd handed me a potential business, a chance to build something of my own, something meaningful that could support me far better than hanging drywall ever would. I leaned back against the workbench, surrounded by the familiar tools of Grandpa's trade. The smell of oil and metal, the sound of Elvis fading as the tape reached its end. In that moment of silence, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Possibility. Not just the day-to-day grind of survival, but actual, tangible opportunities stretching out before me. This island is our dream, Grandpa had written. Not his dream, but our dream. Something we'd shared without me even knowing it. Something he'd held on to for decades, nurturing it, waiting for the right moment to pass it along. And now that moment had come, albeit in a way neither of us would have chosen. The responsibility of that dream, whatever it was, now rested in my hands. My calloused, construction worker hands that had never built anything bigger than a garden shed. I carefully gathered the documents, tucking them back into the metal cylinder for safekeeping. The broken anchor would stay here in the garage, its purpose fulfilled, its secret revealed. Someday, perhaps it would make a nice decoration or conversation piece. Oh, that old thing? Just the rusty mailbox where my grandpa left me an island. The thought made me smile. Grandpa had always had a flair for the dramatic, for turning ordinary moments into stories worth telling. He would have loved the look on my face when I cracked open that anchor. Probably would have laughed that big barrel-chested laugh of his and slapped me on the back. As I locked up the garage, giving one last look at the place that had been Grandpa's sanctuary, I felt a strange mix of emotions, grief for the man I'd lost, gratitude for this final gift, and a nervous excitement about what came next. Back in my truck, I held the metal cylinder against my chest like it contained the Holy Grail itself. In a way, it did not just legal ownership of a piece of land, but a piece of Grandpa's dream. A dream he'd deemed me worthy to continue. Sing your song, he'd written. Another one of those grandpaisms that meant more than the words themselves. He wasn't just telling me to carry a tune. He was telling me to live my life on my own terms. To make something uniquely mine out of what he'd given me. Driving home through Miami traffic, dodging tourists and honking cabs, I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. Yesterday I was Jason Clark, construction worker with a rusty anchor and crushed dreams. Today I was Jason Clark, island owner with, well, still crushed dreams, but maybe some new ones forming on the horizon. I had so many questions, so many things to figure out. Where exactly was this island? How would I get there? What condition was it in? What would I do with it? But beneath all those practical concerns was a more fundamental shift. For the first time since Grandpa died, I felt like I had direction, purpose, something to work toward beyond just making rent and surviving another week. Back at my apartment, I spread the documents across my kitchen table, reading through them more carefully, looking for any additional clues or information I might have missed in the excitement of discovery. The deed was straightforward enough. The survey gave me a better idea of the island's topography. Small but with promising features, including what looked like a freshwater source. The draft agreement with Pacific Pictures was the most interesting. They'd been planning to use the island as a filming location for something called Blue Hawaii Nights, obviously an Elvis-inspired period piece. The irony wasn't lost on me. Grandpa's love of Elvis, extending even to his secret real estate dealings. The agreement outlined a 4-week shooting schedule with a substantial location fee, plus additional payments for any structures or modifications they'd need to make. It wasn't finalized. Grandpa had died before signing, but the terms were clear. This island had commercial potential beyond just being a getaway spot. I sat among the documents in my tiny apartment with its leaky faucet and noisy neighbors, holding the key to something I'd never dreamed possible. This wasn't just a piece of land. This was a chance to play my own solo, as Grandpa might have put it, a chance to build something that was truly mine. You old rock and roll fox. I said again, raising an imaginary toast to Grandpa's memory. You knew exactly what you were doing, didn't you? It all made sense now. Why he'd kept the island secret, why he'd hidden the deed, why he'd chosen this elaborate method of passing it to me. He was protecting his legacy from those who wouldn't appreciate it. He was ensuring that the island would go to someone who might understand its value beyond just dollars and cents. I'd always thought of Grandpa as just a simple mechanic with a love for Elvis and fishing. Now I realized there were layers to him I'd never fully understood. Strategic thinking, long-term planning, a vision that extended far beyond his own lifetime. As night fell over Miami, I sat with a beer, watching headlights sweep across my ceiling through the blinds, listening to the city noise that never quite faded even in the small hours. Tomorrow I'd need to research how to get to the island. I'd need to figure out what supplies to bring, what to expect. I'd need to start making plans. But tonight, I just let myself feel the weight of possibility. The gift Grandpa had given me wasn't just property. It was opportunity, potential, a blank canvas to paint whatever future I could imagine. I looked at the island's name again on the deed. Harmony Key. The name itself felt right somehow. Harmonious, balanced, a place where different elements could come together to create something greater than the sum of its parts. Like Elvis's music, like Grandpa's wisdom, like the blank slate of possibilities stretching out before me. It took me exactly 3 days to get my affairs in order. 3 days of research, phone calls, and more Google Maps satellite viewing than I care to admit. 3 days of lying to my boss about a family emergency that would keep me away from construction site. 3 days of wondering if I was completely losing my mind. But by Friday morning, I was standing at a small marina in Key Largo, duffel bag slung over my shoulder, island coordinates clutched in my hand, trying not to look like a complete amateur as I approached the boat rental counter. The guy behind the counter, mid-50s, skin like tan leather, salt and pepper beard, squinted at me over reading glasses as I explained I needed a boat for the day. Just myself. Yes, I could handle a boat. No, I need a captain. His skeptical expression suggested he wasn't convinced, but money talks, and my deposit was green. The boat he rented me wasn't much. A 20-foot center console with a reliable outboard and basic navigation equipment. Nothing fancy, but it would get me there and back without issue, assuming I didn't somehow manage to sink it. Grandpa had taught me the basics of navigation years ago on the Sea Dream, and I was betting those lessons would come flooding back once I was on the water. As I stowed my gear and checked the GPS, I couldn't help but feel Grandpa would have appreciated this moment. His construction worker grandson playing explorer, heading off to claim an island inheritance that no one else knew existed. This was definitely one for Clark family history books, assuming I didn't get lost at sea and become fish food. The weather was perfect. Clear blue skies, light breeze, the kind of Florida day that makes northerners quit their jobs and move south. I eased out of the marina, following the channel markers until I hit open water, then cranked up the engine and pointed the bow toward the coordinates listed on the deed. The salt spray hit my face as the boat bounced over small waves, and for a moment I was 10 years old again, sitting beside Grandpa as he navigated the Sea Dream through these same waters, Elvis blasting from the portable radio. The memory was so vivid I half expected to turn and see him sitting beside me, adjusting his faded cap and grinning. According to the GPS, Harmony Key was about 12 miles offshore, far enough to feel secluded, but close enough that a decent boat could make the trip without much trouble. As I traveled, I passed a few other small islands in the distance, some developed with fancy houses perched on stilts, others apparently untouched. The waters here were a maze of islands, keys, and shallow reefs that stretched all the way to the horizon. About an hour into the journey, I started scanning the horizon more intently. According to the GPS, I was getting close. And then there it was, a smudge of green rising from the turquoise water, growing larger as I approached. Harmony Key, my island, from a distance. It looked like something from a travel brochure, a curved stretch of white sand beach on one side, backed by palm trees and dense vegetation that rose to form a small hill at the island's center. As I got closer, I could make out a natural harbor on one side, partially protected by a coral reef that caused the waves to break before reaching shore. I reduced speed as I approached, navigating carefully around the reef and into the calm waters of the harbor. The bottom was clearly visible through water, so blue it almost hurt to look at. White sand, scattered coral heads, even a few fish darting around. It was like a natural swimming pool. As the boat glided into shallower water, I cut the engine and let momentum carry me toward the beach. When the hull gently scraped bottom, I hopped over the side into knee-deep water and pulled the boat up onto the sand, securing it with the anchor. Standing on the beach of my own private island, I felt like I should plant a flag or make some kind of grand declaration. Instead, I just stood there with water soaking my shoes, grinning like an idiot at the palm trees swaying the breeze. The sound of waves lapping at the shore mixed with the call of seagulls overhead. It was exactly like the backdrop of Blue Hawaii, minus the Hollywood production team and, well, Elvis himself. I'd been so captivated by my arrival that I hadn't noticed I wasn't alone. About 50 yards down the beach, someone was sitting on the sand with what looked like an easel set up in front of them. A painter, apparently, capturing the island's beauty on canvas. I hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. Technically, this was my island, which meant that person was trespassing. But it's not like I'd posted no trespassing signs, and I wasn't about to march down there and demand they leave what was, until 3 days ago, a place I didn't even know existed. Curiosity won out. I headed down the beach, trying to look casual, like I wandered around tropical islands every day of the week. As I got closer, I could see it was a woman, probably around my age, wearing denim shorts and a loose white tank top splattered with dots of blue and green paint. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she was so focused on her canvas that she didn't notice my approach until I was about 10 feet away. When she finally looked up, I was met with a kind of smile that makes you forget whatever it was you were planning to say. Her eyes caught the sunlight, reflecting the same impossible blue as the water surrounding us. She set down her brush and tilted her head, regarding me with amused curiosity. She gestured to my boat and asked if I was a pirate or just someone who'd lost their compass. The question was delivered with a laugh that suggested she wasn't particularly concerned either way. I laughed too, feeling suddenly self-conscious about my unplanned arrival. I introduced myself and, after a brief hesitation, admitted that according to a recently discovered deed, I apparently owned this island. The words sounded ridiculous even as I said them, like a plot from some cheesy made-for-TV movie. To my surprise, she didn't seem shocked. She just nodded like this made perfect sense and introduced herself as Amber, a 28-year-old artist who'd been coming to this island for years to paint. She explained that Harmony Key was something of an open secret among locals, a seemingly unclaimed slice of paradise that boaters and kayakers would visit for day trips. No one had ever seen any signs of ownership or development, so everyone just assumed it was fair game. She invited me to take a look at her painting, a vibrant rendering of the island's natural harbor with colors that somehow captured the light in a way that photos never could. Paint smudges decorated her hands and had found their way onto her jeans. Amber had talent. That much was obvious even to someone like me whose art appreciation usually began and ended with album covers. I told her a simplified version of how I'd recently inherited the island from my grandfather. I kept the details vague. No need to share the whole anchor mystery with someone I had just met. When she asked what I planned to do with the place, I admitted I was still figuring that out. Something about Amber's easygoing nature made conversation flow naturally, and as we talked, I gradually mentioned Grandpa's love for Elvis and his philosophical outlook on life. I described him as someone who believed in places where the soul could dance rock and roll, a phrase he used often that always stuck with me. Amber smiled at that phrase, nodding like she understood exactly what Grandpa meant. She stood up, brushing sand from her jeans, and offered to show me around. After all, she'd been coming here for years and knew the island better than I did, despite my name being on the deed. We walked the perimeter first. The island wasn't large. You could walk the whole coastline in maybe half an hour, but it was diverse. The white sand beach where we'd met curved around almost half the island, while the other half featured rocky outcroppings that created natural tide pools teeming with tiny marine life. Palms and sea grapes dominated the vegetation, providing patches of shade that offer relief from the relentless Florida sun. As we walked, Amber pointed out the island's features with the enthusiasm of a real estate agent who actually believed in the property she was selling. The natural freshwater spring near the center of the island, the highest point with 360-degree views of surrounding ocean, the spot where sea turtles sometimes came to nest in season. She described how the island changed with the seasons, which parts flooded during strong storms, which areas stayed high and dry even in the worst weather, which sections of beach eroded and rebuilt themselves in a constant dance with the tides. This place, she explained, was like a blank canvas, wild and unspoiled but with potential. Day trippers loved it because it felt untouched, but it was close enough to civilization that you didn't feel completely cut off from the world. As we reached the highest point of the island, a modest hill that rose maybe 30 feet above sea level, I found myself looking at Harmony Key with new eyes, not just as a peculiar inheritance or a piece of real estate, but as possibility. I started thinking out loud, describing a vision that was forming in my mind, a small, retro-style resort that would capture the spirit of the 1960s. I call it Elvis-land. Nothing huge or garish, but a place that would feel like stepping back in time. A cafe with a vintage jukebox playing All Shook Up and Heartbreak Hotel. A small motel with neon signs and themed rooms. An outdoor cinema where guests could watch Viva Las Vegas under the stars. Amber didn't laugh at the idea. Instead, her eyes lit up and she started adding her own suggestions. She described an annual Elvis festival that could bring in fans from all over. Imagine hundreds of Elvis impersonators in sequin jumpsuits singing Suspicious Minds on this very beach. The visual was so ridiculous and perfect that we both broke into laughter. We spent the next couple of hours wandering the island, our conversation flowing between practical considerations, permits, construction logistics, water and power, and increasingly elaborate fantasy additions to Elvis-land, a blue suede shoes gift shop, coconut cocktails named after Elvis songs, a wedding chapel for couples wanting to be married by an Elvis officiant. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, we found ourselves back at the beach where we'd started. Amber had packed a small cooler with sandwiches and drinks, which she generously shared. We sat on the sand, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have looked exaggerated in one of Amber's paintings, but was somehow just the natural magic of this place. In that moment of twilight tranquility, Amber said something that stuck with me. Dreams, she mused, are like songs you sing even when the world is telling you to be quiet. Everyone has their own melody, but few have the courage to let it be heard above the noise of conventional expectations. The philosophy reminded me so much of Grandpa that I couldn't help but smile. It was as if his spirit had somehow found its way to this island ahead of me, whispering wisdom through this paint-splattered artist I'd just met but somehow felt like I'd known much longer. As stars began appearing in the darkening sky, I thought about Grandpa's draft agreement with the film company. Could that be the first step toward making Elvis-land more than just a sunset fantasy? Was there actually potential here for something real, something sustainable? The practical side of my brain, the part that had kept me showing up to construction jobs I hated because bills needed paying, tried to inject some reality into the situation. I had no experience in hospitality or tourism. I had limited savings and a credit score that wasn't going to impress any loan officers. I had a deed to an island, yes, but transforming raw land into a functioning business was a far cry from hammering nails into drywall. But then there was Grandpa's note: sing your song, not be practical, or sell it to the highest bidder, or play it safe. He'd held on to this island for decades, waiting for the right moment to pass it along to me. There had to be a reason. I glanced at Amber, who was gazing up at the emerging stars with contentment that suggested she'd found her place in the universe. In just a few hours, she'd gone from stranger to confidant, her enthusiasm for Elvis land matching my own in a way that made the wild idea seem almost possible. The moon rose over the water, casting a silver path across the waves. In the distance, the lights of the mainland twinkled like earthbound stars. But here on Harmony Key, it was just us, the sound of waves, and the infinite possibilities that seemed to hover in the salt-laden air. I broke the comfortable silence, asking Amber why she kept coming back to this specific island when the Keys were full of beautiful spots to paint. Her answer was immediate and certain. This place had soul, not just beauty, which was everywhere in the Florida Keys if you looked, but a kind of resonance that she couldn't find elsewhere. It was the light, the energy, the feeling that you were simultaneously connected to everything and entirely free. That was when I knew Grandpa hadn't just left me an island. He'd left me the blueprint for the next chapter of my life. Elvis Land wasn't just a whimsical idea born of sunset conversations with a pretty artist. It was a continuation of something Grandpa had started decades ago when he first discovered this island and recognized its special quality. As the night deepened around us, I found myself saying aloud, though quietly enough that it might have been just to myself, "Grandpa, I think we just tuned the guitar." Amber smiled at that, though she couldn't have known the full context. In that moment, under a canopy of stars on an island that was somehow both foreign and familiar, the path ahead seemed clearer than it had in years. Tomorrow there would be practicalities to deal with: the return to the mainland, research into permits and regulations, figuring out exactly how a construction worker with limited savings could possibly finance a retro-themed island resort. But tonight, sitting on the sand beside a near stranger who already felt like a partner in this crazy venture, those concerns seemed distant and manageable. The fantasy was taking shape, becoming more tangible with each passing minute. I could see it all. Guests arriving by boat to be greeted by the gentle croon that can't help falling in love, playing over subtle speakers hidden among the palms. The cafe with its chrome-edged tables and vintage jukebox. The simple but stylish rooms named after Elvis hits. The outdoor movie screen with beach chair seating and tiki torches. It wouldn't be easy. Nothing worthwhile ever is. But for the first time since Grandpa died, hell, maybe for the first time ever, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. As the stars wheeled overhead and the waves provided their constant rhythm, I let myself fully embrace the possibility that Harmony Key represented. Not just an escape from the life I'd been sleepwalking through, but a chance to build something meaningful, something with soul, something that would make Grandpa proud. And somehow, sitting there on that moonlit beach with plans both practical and fantastical swirling in my mind, I knew he already was. The night on Harmony Key was magical, but not exactly comfortable. I slept on a rental boat, using my duffel bag as a makeshift pillow while the gentle rocking of waves serenaded me to sleep. Amber had come prepared with a small tent she pitched just beyond the beach line, clearly not her first overnight stay on the island. As dawn broke over the water, painting the sky in watercolor shades of pink and gold, we shared a simple breakfast of granola bars and bottled water. Neither of us was eager to leave, but reality waited back on the mainland, jobs, responsibilities, and in my case, figuring out exactly how to turn this wild dream into something tangible. The ride back to Key Largo was mostly quiet, both of us lost in our own thoughts as the boat cut through morning waves. Amber had arrived on the island with friends who dropped her off for a painting session, planning to retrieve her later. When I offered her a ride back to the mainland, she accepted with that easy smile that was quickly becoming familiar. We exchanged numbers before parting ways at the marina, promising to stay in touch about Elvis Land, what had started as a sunset fantasy but was rapidly crystallizing into something that felt like destiny. As I watched her walk away, paint-splattered backpack slung over one shoulder, I had the distinct feeling that Harmony Key had given me more than just real estate. Back in Miami, My apartment felt smaller than ever. The walls seemed to close in, the city noise more intrusive, the routine of my life suddenly unbearable in a way it hadn't been before I'd stood on my own island and glimpsed what could be. I called in sick to work again, the stomach bug apparently lingering, and spread the island documents across my kitchen table. The draft agreement with Pacific Pictures caught my attention. It wasn't finalized, but it laid out terms for a month-long film shoot with a substantial location fee. Grandpa had been in negotiations with them just weeks before his death. The contact information for their location scout was right there at the top of the page. What did I have to lose? I composed an email, introducing myself as Fred Clark's grandson and the new owner of Harmony Key. I explained that I'd found their draft agreement and was interested in continuing the conversation about filming on the island. Then I hit send before I could talk myself out of it. I expected to wait days for a response, if one came at all. Instead, my phone rang less than an hour later. The location scout, a fast-talking woman named Vicky with a hint of New York in her accent, was practically ecstatic. They'd been trying to reach my grandfather for weeks, assuming he'd lost interest. The shoot was scheduled to begin in just over a month, and they'd been scrambling to find an alternative location. Could we meet tomorrow to discuss details? Was the island still available? Had I made any changes to the property? The questions came rapid fire, barely giving me time to process that this was actually happening. We arranged to meet at a cafe near their Miami production office. The following morning, I spent that night researching film location contracts, trying to understand the terminology, the standard rates, what was negotiable and what wasn't. By the time I walked into that meeting, I had maybe 3 hours of sleep, but I was armed with enough knowledge to at least not sound like a complete amateur. The meeting went better than I had any right to expect. Pacific Pictures was shooting a romantic comedy called Paradise Beats, set in the 1960s, heavy on the beach vibes, with a soundtrack inspired by Elvis and other icons of the era. Harmony Key was perfect for their needs. Undeveloped, authentic, with that timeless quality that would make their period piece feel genuine. They offered even more than what had been in the draft agreement. Apparently, their previously secured backup location had fallen through, putting them in a time crunch. I tried not to look too eager as we discussed terms, nodding thoughtfully as if I negotiated film contracts every Tuesday of my life. By the end of our meeting, I walked away with a signed agreement and a promise of the first payment within a week. Just like that, I had startup capital, enough to begin making Elvis land more than just a daydream on a beach. I called Amber as soon as I left the meeting, the words tumbling out in an excited rush. Her reaction matched my own, a mix of disbelief, excitement, and immediate practical questions about what came next. What came next was a whirlwind. I quit my construction job the same day the first payment hit my bank account. My foreman shook his head, telling me I'd be back when whatever wild scheme I was cooking up inevitably failed. Maybe he was right, but for the first time in years, failure seemed like a risk worth taking. Amber proved to be more than just an artistic visionary. She had connections throughout the Keys, friends in local government, knowledge of permit processes, and an uncanny ability to find the right person for any job. Within days, we'd secured a meeting with county officials to discuss our development plans. The local authorities were surprisingly receptive. Tourism was their lifeblood, and a unique, themed destination like Elvis Land had the potential to draw visitors year-round. The Elvis connection was particularly appealing. Apparently, the king still had plenty of pulling power, even decades after his death. With the film money as seed capital and the local government giving us a green light, Amber suggested we launch a crowdfunding campaign to generate additional funds and, more importantly, begin building a community around the project. She designed a campaign page featuring her paintings of the island alongside renderings of what Elvis Land could become, while I wrote the copy, explaining our vision for a place where the spirit of the 50s and 60s would live on in a tropical paradise. We launched the campaign with modest expectations. Maybe a few Elvis fans would throw some money our way. Maybe we'd raise enough for some preliminary architectural plans. What we didn't expect was a response that followed. The Elvis fan community turned out to be vast, passionate, and surprisingly internet savvy. The campaign was shared in fan groups from Texas to New York, from Japan to Australia. Donations poured in. $20 here, $100 there, occasionally $1,000 or more from serious collectors and superfans. Each contribution came with messages of support, stories about what Elvis meant to them, excitement about visiting once we opened. Within 2 weeks, we'd raised enough to begin the first phase of development, the centerpiece cafe we'd named Hound Dog. Using my construction background and Amber's design vision, we drew up plans for a 1950s-style diner right on the beach, complete with vintage jukebox, chrome-edged tables, and a black and white checker floor. I hired a small crew of builders I knew from my construction days, guys I trusted to do quality work without cutting corners. We ferried materials out to the island on a barge, set up a temporary camp, and broke ground on what would become the heart of Elvis-land. Working on the island was different from any construction job I'd ever had. There was something almost sacred about it, shaping this untouched land into something new while respecting its natural beauty. We built the cafe on stilts near the beach, designing it to withstand hurricanes while maximizing the ocean views. The structure took shape quickly, my crew catching the vision and putting in extra hours without being asked. The jukebox was my personal project, a restored 1956 Seaboog V200, found through an online auction and refurbished to its original glory. It held 200 selections, every Elvis single ever released, plus contemporaries from Roy Orbison to Buddy Holly. When we finally got hooked up and Jailhouse Rock blasted to the cafe for the first time, the sound echoing across the water, I felt Grandpa's presence so strongly I had to take a moment to compose myself. Next came the outdoor cinema, a simple but effective setup with a weather-resistant screen, vintage-style canvas director's chairs for seating, and a collection of Elvis movies ready to play under the stars. The first test screening of Blue Hawaii at sunset, with the actual blue waters of Harmony Key visible just beyond the screen, was a moment I'll never forget. Our crowdfunding supporters received regular updates, their excitement growing with each new development. We were starting to get press attention, too, first from local Florida papers, then from travel blogs, and finally from a major Elvis fan magazine that wanted to do a feature story on the project. Everything was moving forward better than we could have hoped. The film crew came and went, shooting their romantic comedy against the backdrop of our half-finished paradise, paying us well and generating publicity in the process. Local businesses were reaching out about partnerships, tour companies were inquiring about transportation services, and the first phase of Elvis-land was nearing completion. Amber and I had fallen into an easy partnership, her artistic vision complementing my practical building skills in ways that neither of us could have accomplished alone. We spent most days on the island together, working from sunrise to sunset, then sitting on the beach planning the next day's tasks as stars appeared overhead. The line between business partners and something more was beginning to blur, though neither of us had put that feeling into words yet. And then, like a discordant note in a perfect melody, my phone rang one evening as we were reviewing plans for guest cabins. Uncle Roy's name flashed on the screen, the first contact from any family member since a reading months ago. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. His voice boomed through the speaker, all false joviality and forced warmth, asking how I'd been, commenting on the weather, making small talk that was so obviously leading somewhere that I found myself gripping the phone tighter with each passing second. Finally, he got to the point. He'd heard through mutual acquaintances about a project I was working on, an island development, something about Elvis. Was there any truth to these rumors? I confirmed as briefly as possible, offering no details beyond what was already public knowledge. The shift in his tone was immediate, from forced friendliness to barely contained rage. He demanded to know where I'd gotten the money, how I'd acquired an island, what kind of scam I was running using his father's name. When I explained that Grandpa had left me the island through documents hidden in the anchor, the explosion I'd been expecting finally came. Roy's voice lost all pretense of civility as he raged about theft, about family betrayal, about how I had stolen what rightfully belonged to him and Marge. Over the next few days, the situation escalated. Registered letters arrived from a high-priced law firm representing Uncle Roy and Aunt Marge, demanding I cease development immediately and turn over the island to its rightful owners. They claimed the deed transfer was fraudulent, that Grandpa had been mentally incompetent when he signed it, that I had somehow manipulated an old man in his final days. The accusations were as hurtful as they were baseless. Grandpa had been sharp as a tack right up until the end, working in his garage, making plans, hiding those documents in the anchor just a week before his sudden heart attack. He'd orchestrated everything deliberately, ensuring the island would pass to me without interference. The idea that I'd somehow tricked him was not just false, but an insult to his memory. I took the letters to a lawyer of my own, not some fancy firm with marble floors and receptionists who looked like runway models, but a practical family attorney recommended by one of the county officials we'd been working with. She reviewed the deed, the transfer documents, and the inheritance paperwork. Her assessment was clear. The island was mine, legally and without question. Grandpa had owned it outright since the 1960s, had transferred to me weeks before his death through proper legal channels, and had been of sound mind when doing so, according to his doctor's affidavit included with the transfer. Their case had no merit. But having no case didn't mean they couldn't cause problems. Roy and Marge had money, not fortune-level wealth, but enough to hire lawyers who could drag things out, file injunctions, create delays that might bleed our fledgling project dry before it could really take flight. Amber found me on the beach that evening, staring out at the water, the lawyer's assessment in one hand, the threatening letters in the other. Without a word, she sat beside me, her shoulder touching mine in silent support. After a moment, she reminded me of something important. We'd already started building. The cafe was nearly complete. The cinema was operational, and our crowdfunding supporters were invested not just financially, but emotionally in seeing Elvis-land succeed. She squeezed my shoulder, reminded me that Grandpa must have known that I would carry this vision forward better than anyone else. That's why he'd chosen me. Hidden the deed where only I would find it, set everything in motion before he passed. He knew I would make this place sing the right song. I remembered Grandpa's words about what makes a real treasure, that it's something you build for others, not something you lock away in a safe. That philosophy had guided the entire Elvis-land project from the beginning. We weren't just building a tourist attraction. We were creating a place where people could connect with a simpler time, where music and movies brought joy, where memories could be made against a backdrop of tropical beauty. The next morning, I called Uncle Roy directly. He answered with a grunt of surprise, clearly not expecting to hear from me. In the calmest voice I could manage, I invited him and Aunt Marge to visit Harmony Key, to see what we were building, to understand Grandpa's vision before they decided to fight it. His response was predictably hostile. More threats, more accusations. I listened until he ran out of steam, then simply said that if they wanted to see the island their father had loved enough to keep secret for decades, they were welcome anytime. If they preferred to fight over it in court, that was their choice. Either way, Elvis-land would move forward. As a parting shot, I suggested they might want to book a room when we opened. After all, family discount and everything. His spluttering rage was cut short as I ended the call. Back at the cafe construction site, I found my resolve strengthening with each nail driven, each board secured. The conflict with Roy and Marge was like a storm on the horizon, potentially destructive, but not enough to change course. We built Hound Dog Cafe solid enough to withstand hurricane winds. We could weather a family dispute. The jukebox played Don't Be Cruel as we worked on the finishing touches, installing the chrome edge counter, setting up the vintage-style coffee machine, arranging the red vinyl bar stools. The smell of fresh paint mixed with the ocean breeze, creating a heady combination that smelled like possibility. Amber worked alongside me, paintbrush in hand, adding the final touches to the mural of Elvis that would greet visitors as they entered. Neither of us mentioned the legal threats. They seemed distant and unimportant in the face of what we were creating. As the sun began to set, casting long golden rays across our half-finished paradise, I found myself humming along to Can't Help Falling in Love as it played softly to the cafe speakers. The first phase of Elvis-land was nearly complete, ready to welcome the film crew for their wrap party in just a few days, our unofficial soft opening. Let Uncle Roy hire his fancy lawyers. Let Aunt Marge make her accusations. They couldn't touch what we'd built here, not just physically, but the community that had formed around this crazy dream, the supporters who checked our updates daily, the locals who had embraced our vision as part of the Keys' future. I looked out from the cafe deck at the island that had changed everything. The swaying palms, the white sand beach, the turquoise water stretching to the horizon. Somewhere out there, I like to think Grandpa was watching, nodding in approval as his hidden treasure fulfilled its purpose. Want an island getaway, Roy? I muttered to the sunset. Book a room at Elvis-themed. We might even upgrade you to the Heartbreak Hotel suite. The joke was small comfort against the storm that was gathering, but for now, it was enough. We had come too far to turn back. The music had started, and come hell or high water, we were going to let it play. It had been 18 months since I first set foot on Harmony Key with nothing but a deed and a dream. 18 months of permits and construction, of setbacks and breakthroughs, of legal threats and small victories. 18 months that transformed a construction worker with a rusty anchor into something I never imagined possible. A business owner with a vision that actually worked. That night, Elvis-themed glowed against the night sky, neon signs reflecting off the water like something from another era miraculously transported to this tiny island in the Florida Keys. The grand opening weekend had exceeded even our most optimistic projections. Every cabin booked solid, the ferry running continuous trips from the mainland, social media buzzing with photos tagged #Elvis-themed and #Harmony Key. From my spot on the deck of the Hound Dog Cafe, I could take in the full scope of what we created. The cafe itself had become the heart of the place. Chrome and vinyl and that iconic checkered floor, with a jukebox playing all shook up, while waitstaff in 50s-style uniforms served burgers and milkshakes to tourists wearing Hawaiian shirts and Elvis T-shirts. Beyond the cafe stretched our little beachfront promenade, tiki torches illuminating the pathway between the outdoor cinema, currently screening Blue Hawaii to a packed audience, and a small collection of guest cabins we'd named Heartbreak Hotel. Each cabin was themed around a different Elvis era, from the gold lame 50s to the 68 comeback special to the Vegas jumpsuits. Amber's artistic touch was evident everywhere. Hand-painted murals, clever design details, nothing mass-produced or generic. The early legal battles with Uncle Roy and Aunt Marge had fizzled out faster than we expected. Their case had no merit, and even their high-priced attorneys eventually advised them to drop it before they wasted more money. They retreated to their comfortable suburban lives, occasionally sending threatening letters that became less frequent as Elvis-themed gained legitimacy and press coverage. What started as a David versus Goliath struggle gradually transformed into a genuine success story that even local news picked up. Construction worker turned secret island inheritance into Elvis-themed resort made for good headlines. The publicity only fueled our bookings, with Elvis fans making pilgrimages from as far away as Japan and Australia. The crowdfunding supporters who helped make this possible were our first guests, treated to a special weekend before the official opening. Many of them became friends, returning regularly and bringing others. There was a community forming around this place. Not just tourists passing through, but people who felt connected to what we built, who understood that Elvis-themed was more than just a themed resort. That night marked our biggest event yet, the first annual Harmony Key Elvis Festival. When Amber first suggested hosting a gathering of Elvis tribute artists, I thought maybe we'd get 5 or 6 performers and a small audience. Instead, we got over 50 Elvis impersonators from across the country, spanning every era from the rockabilly beginnings to the jumpsuit years. They performed in rotating sets throughout the day on our beachfront stage, while fans in vintage clothing danced in the sand. The evening culminated in a group performance of Burning Love, dozens of sequined Elvises singing in unison while colored lights swept across the beach. The surreal image of all those pompadours and jumpsuits against the backdrop of a tropical sunset was something I knew I'd never forget. As the festival wound down, and guests began dispersing to their cabins or catching the last ferry back to the mainland, I noticed a familiar face at the entrance to the cafe. Uncle Roy, looking uncomfortable in a tropical shirt that didn't quite fit his frame, stood hesitantly at the threshold, as if unsure whether he was allowed to enter. Beside him, Aunt Marge clutched her designer purse, her expression a mix of curiosity and lingering resentment. They hadn't RSVP'd to the formal invitation I'd sent, more as a peace offering than with any expectation they'd actually come. So their appearance now, at the tail end of our biggest event, caught me completely off guard. For a moment, I considered ignoring them. After all, they'd spent the past year and a half trying to take this place away from me, to erase everything we'd built here. But then I remembered Grandpa's voice. Holding grudges is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. I crossed the cafe, weaving between satisfied customers and Elvis memorabilia, until I was standing in front of the two people who tried their best to crush my dream before it could take flight. Up close, Uncle Roy looked older than I remembered, the lines around his eyes deeper, his posture slightly stooped. Aunt Marge's hair showed more gray than it did at the reading. Without a word, I gestured them toward an empty booth in the corner and signaled the waitress for coffee. The awkward silence stretched between us as Roy examined the decor, his eyes lingering on the vintage photos of Elvis that lined the walls. Marge fidgeted with a paper napkin, folding and unfolding it with nervous energy. Finally, Roy cleared his throat and admitted that they'd been following the progress of Elvis-land online. Their tone had shifted from the hostile legal threats of months past. There was a reluctant admiration in the way Roy acknowledged that I'd actually pulled this off, transformed a wild island into a functioning business that people were traveling thousands of miles to visit. I poured Roy's coffee myself, resisting the urge to make him wait for service. As he took his first sip, he muttered that I'd really made something of this place, that I'd given it some heat, Jason. Coming from him, it was practically a standing ovation. The conversation that followed was stilted but civil. They asked about the challenges of island construction, about the Elvis impersonators, about how we manage utilities and waste disposal. Practical questions that revealed more interest than they'd like to admit. I answered honestly, neither downplaying the difficulties nor exaggerating our success. When they asked about Grandpa, why he kept the island secret all those years, why he chose to pass it to me this way, I shared my theory, that he wanted the island to become something alive, something that would bring joy to people, that he knew if it had gone to them, it would have been sold to developers for a quick profit. That his vision for Harmony Key was always about creating a place with soul, not just another piece of real estate. Whether they accepted this explanation or not, I couldn't tell. But when Roy mentioned that their father always did have his own way of doing things, there was a hint of something like understanding in his voice. They didn't stay long, just enough to finish their coffee and take a brief tour of the main facilities. As they prepared to catch the last ferry back to the mainland, Roy awkwardly extended his hand. I shook it, not because all was forgiven, but because holding on to anger was never part of Grandpa's philosophy or mine. After they left, I found Amber on the beach, supervising the breakdown of the festival stage. She'd been the backbone of this whole operation. Her artistic vision balanced by surprising business acumen, her energy seemingly inexhaustible. Somewhere along the way, our partnership evolved into something deeper. The line between work and life blurred and then disappeared altogether, both of us pouring everything we had into making Elvis-land a reality. She noticed my expression and asked about my unexpected family reunion. I gave her the abbreviated version as we walked along the shoreline, away from the lights and music, to the quiet end of the beach where the natural beauty of Harmony Key remained untouched by our development. The moon cast a silver path across the water, reminiscent of that first night we spent here dreaming about what this place could become. So much had changed since then, yet the essential magic of the island remained. The rhythm of waves against sand, the whisper of palm fronds in the night breeze, the sense of being somewhere that existed slightly out of step with the modern world. From my pocket, I pulled Grandpa's old cassette player, the same one that used to accompany us on fishing trips. I'd found it while clearing out a garage months ago, preserve it as a memento of the man who made all this possible. The tape inside was worn from countless plays, but when I pressed a button, Love Me Tender still emerged clear enough to hear over the gentle surf. Amber leaned against me as the music played, both of us tired but content after the long day of festivities. The development of Elvis-land was far from complete. We had plans for expansion, for additional cabins, for more events throughout the year. But in that moment, it felt like we'd already accomplished something significant. Not just a business venture, but a place that mattered to people, that created memories, that preserved something valuable about American culture that might otherwise be forgotten. I thought about Grandpa's words, one of those philosophical nuggets he was so fond of sharing during our fishing trips. A place of the soul is something you give to the world, not something you hold tight in your fist. At the time, it had seemed like another of his cryptic sayings. Now, looking out over what we built, I understood what he meant. Elvis Land wasn't just a resort. It was a gift. To the fans who found connection there, to the musicians who kept the King's legacy alive, to visitors seeking a taste of simpler times. Even, in its way, to Uncle Roy and Aunt Marge, who might never fully appreciate the island's true value, but who could at least see that their father's vision didn't die with him. A year before, I was just a construction worker living paycheck to paycheck in a cramped Miami apartment. My life as predictable as the city bus schedule. Now I was watching the moonlight on water that belonged to me, listening to Elvis on Grandpa's cassette player, standing beside a woman who shared my crazy dream and helped make it real. The path there wasn't easy. There were moments when the permits seemed impossible to obtain, when the money was running dangerously low, when the legal threats loomed large enough to keep me awake at night. Times when I questioned whether Grandpa had done me a favor or saddled me with an impossible burden. Days when the construction seemed endless, when every rainfall brought new challenges, when I wondered if we were building castles in sand that the first storm would wash away. But for every setback, there was a breakthrough. For every problem, a solution appeared. Sometimes through hard work, sometimes through luck, often through the community that formed around this project and wanted to see it succeed. Behind us, Elvis Land continued its evening rhythm, the outdoor cinema reaching the finale of Blue Hawaii, the last ferry departing with its load of day visitors, the overnight guests settling into their themed cabins, the staff, mostly local Keys residents grateful for year-round employment, officially cleaning up after the festival, preparing for another day tomorrow. It was a living, breathing entity now. Not just my dream or Grandpa's, but something that belonged to everyone who contributed to it or found joy in visiting. Something that would outlast any single person, that had taken on a life beyond what any of us could have planned. As the cassette clicked to its end, Amber squeezed my hand and suggested we should head back. There was still work to be done before we could call it a night. But I lingered a moment longer, looking out over the water, feeling the weight and wonder of everything that had happened since that rusty anchor landed in my apartment. Some might call it luck or coincidence that led me there, but I prefer to think it was Grandpa's final gift. Not just the island itself, but the push to become something more than I'd imagined possible, to create something meaningful, to find my own song and sing it loud enough for the world to hear. In the distance, the lights of the mainland twinkled like earthbound stars. But here on Harmony Key, our own little piece of paradise, the rhythm was different, slower, more authentic, a backbeat from another era that somehow still resonated today. I took one last look at the moonlit water before turning back toward the warm glow of Elvis Land, thinking of how proud Grandpa would be to see his secret island transformed into this vibrant place. Thinking of how far I'd come from that construction worker who once stared at a rusty anchor in bewilderment. We sang our song, Grandpa, I Whispered to the Night Breeze, and it's playing all over the world. With Amber by my side, I walked back toward the lights and music, toward the dream we built from an inheritance that seemed worthless but contained everything valuable, toward the future that continued to unfold in ways I never could have predicted when this journey began. The path ahead was illuminated by tiki torches and neon signs, by starlight and possibility. Whatever challenges tomorrow would bring, I'd face them with the lessons Grandpa taught me, with the strength I had discovered in myself, with the community we built around this unlikely paradise. Elvis Land shone against the night sky, a beacon of nostalgia and joy in a world that often moved too fast to remember its own music. And I, Jason Clark, once just a guy with callous hands and modest aspirations, had found my place in song.